Well, welcome back, and thank you for having me back again. I'm going to continue a discussion of the Middle Ages with you. Today, I wanted just to kind of take a quick survey of the 10th through the 12th centuries. We're going to dovetail a little with the 13th because there's a couple of dynamics that start that, just to kind of show you how they end, we need to go a little bit beyond the chronological boundary. But one of the major things that starts in the 10th century for us, for the Coptic Church, is the fact that Coptic Arabic literature begins. Now, if you remember, we touched on this last time in that we kind of started slow. The Syrians got onto this in mid-8th century. By the 9th century, they have several authors, major authors, who are writing in Arabic, defending Christianity and teaching their populace. In Egypt in general, it starts a bit later. The very first person in Egypt, non-Muslim, to start writing in Arabic, and actually I did not put his name on the screen. I should have. Sadeh Gayon, a Jewish teacher rabbi. He's the first to write in Arabic. First Christian is the Melkite, the pro-Chalcedonian patriarch of Egypt, Sa'id ibn Batrik, or Eutychus, writing Nazm al-Jawhar, and that becomes a very important history. Among other things, there's several other things that he wrote, but this history has a particular importance. Among his writings were some polemical writings that the first Copt to write in Arabic, or I should say the first major Coptic author, because possibly there were others before him, but kind of wrote anonymous texts. But the first major figure is Severus ibn al-Muqaffa. Now he dies sometime after 1000, 110, but he is active right in the mid-century, and some of the earliest writings on the councils. Much of this is kind of a rebuttal to Sa'id ibn Batri. In general, Severus ibn Muqaffa is going to become the beginning, or the first author in a slew of authors that's going to come about in the next 4 centuries or so. He is important on many fronts, and we'll return to him again in a minute. But not only does he start this genre within the Coptic Church, but it's important to note that none of his writings are in Coptic or were translated into Coptic. Why is this important? When we look at the phenomena in Syria, not only did it start 2 centuries before, but in Syria, a lot of this literature or analogous literature tended to be in Arabic or Syriac or bilingual Arabic-Syriac sort of compositions. But it tells us that there's still a large percentage of the population still reading Syriac. With Severus ibn al-Muqaffa, we seem to have kind of not only started later, and as we mentioned last time, we're going to catch up. We write a lot in Arabic. But it seems that he started writing at something of a point of no return had been passed. Okay, there's a shift taking place, and it's taking place or beginning to take place in the 10th century. The lack of translations of his works into Coptic is an important indicator as to the language shift in Egypt, and this is something that we'll return to in a little bit. Whenever we're dealing with Severus, we also have to keep in mind that there's a lot of literature falsely attributed to him. Now, on one hand, he was a major author, so he did write a lot. There is a lot that survives from him. Unfortunately, what is edited and available is not that much, but he wrote a tremendous amount. But for a while there, it seemed that the criteria was, well, if it's in Arabic, it's about the church, it's kind of sophisticated, it must be Severus. We'll attribute it to Severus ibn al-Muqaffa. And hence, there's a lot of literature attributed to him, some of it written centuries after he had passed away. So we have to be careful in what is attributed to him. Unfortunately, the one publication that kind of the average Copt associates with, well, there's two of them. I'll come to the second one in a minute. But of the two, the one that is most popular is this little booklet that was published and republished in Egypt several times under his name. And the title of it is Kitab al-Durr al-Thamin fi Idah al-Din, the precious pearl and the elucidation of the faith. But that text is falsely attributed to him, and that text was probably written at the earliest, about 50 years after Severus had died. And hence some of the somewhat wacky ideas. There's a couple of ideas in there that people kind of tend to pick on. You can't really blame Severus for that. That's not his authentic writing. Now, during the age that he is living, this is the period in which the Fatimids come into Egypt, and the Fatimids become the ruling dynasty all over Egypt and Syria, and also, of course, North Africa, extending into what is modern day Tunisia. But the heart very quickly becomes Egypt and Syria. And keep in mind that for a lot of our history, relations between us and Syria were very, very strong, not only ecclesiastically, but politically. Throughout the Middle Egypt, more often than not, Egypt was and Syria were ruled by the same regime or siblings of the same ruling family. So circumstances, religious, social, economic, political, were often quite similar in Egypt and Syria in that regard. The coming of the Fatimids were Shias, but they didn't really go out of their way to attract Sunnis, not outright anyway. And they understood that the majority of the Muslims in Egypt were Sunnis, and hence they kind of let everyone kind of practice their creed as they wanted. The early phase is a very important phase, because this is where we have not only Severus ibn al-Muqaffa, but the famous patriarch Avraham ibn Zara. Patriarch Avraham was a Syrian, and I was just mentioning kind of the strong connections between Egypt and Syria. Keep in mind that the really strong sort of nationalist ideas about Egypt and Syria being separate, that is a reflection of the modern era. That's a reflection of the last 120 years. That is completely anachronistic when you look at what is happening in the Middle Ages or the patristic era or the early centuries of Christianity. We've had 5 patriarchs who are Syrians. That is not by accident. Avraham, of course, is associated with the miracle that I have there at the bottom. Let me get my pointer, the laser pointer. The miracle of the moving of the Muqattam. We attribute the introduction of the fast that we just recently had with fast of Nineveh or of Jonah introduced to him. The dates match up roughly. I haven't really seen anything early that definitively links him to the introduction of the fast, but it's definitely a fast that came from Syria, and the Syrian Orthodox actually got it from the Church of the East, the so-called Nestorians. There, it originated with them, passed over from the Church of the East to their fellow Syrian speakers, the Syrian Orthodox, and from the Syrian Orthodox we got it, and we handed it off to the Ethiopians. That's how it progressed. Very early phase, we start finding some interesting dynamics. One of them is the issue with new church construction. Now, up until this point, so from the time of the Arab conquest, 740, 741, until the late 10th century, the late 900s, you do find this issue coming up now and again, but there's no consistent policy. And in the few cases in which it was problematic, once the governor that made an issue of it or what have you either left Egypt or died or what have you, usually the construction project that was proposed went through. Here, what makes kind of the tensions at the end of the 10th century kind of interesting is that on one hand, if interesting is even the right word for it, but on one hand, this is going to be persistent from that point on. The construction of new churches is going to be a major point of tension and conflict consistently. The other aspect is that the populace gets involved. In a lot of the earlier cases, it would seem that it was kind of handled on the upper end of, administration per se. It's the governor, it's the equivalent of a lieutenant governor, but somebody in power, in a position of authority is, contesting the issue or what have you. But you don't find kind of a popular Islamic resistance to it. And here you start finding this for the first time in the sources. Under the Fatimids, they also start something that was taking place in Baghdad. Keep in mind that this period, throughout Fatimid rule, the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad are still claiming to be the legitimate caliphs, and they're Sunnis. In Egypt and Syria, you have the Fatimids who are claiming to be the legitimate caliphs, the legitimate successors of Muhammad. So a lot of the institutions are going to have kind of mirror sites. You'll have these think tank-like institutions that emerge both in Baghdad and in Cairo. The Majalis, these sessions that I'll discuss in a second, they also emerge in both regions. There's kind of a competition for legitimacy and the trappings of legitimacy. The Majalis were kind of interesting because these were almost kind of like 19th century French salons sort of thing, where everybody's sitting around and discussing, at that time, religion and religion. They're not even discussing politics. You do find interesting exchanges. We do have some documentation as to what went on in these gatherings. The one thing apparently that the Fatimids kind of insisted on was that the debate had to be civil, but they would have representatives from the major Christian factions, so from the Melkites and from the Coptic Church. The representation was always during that early period with Patriarch Ephraim and Severus. And when you look at the details, it would appear that the one who's doing all the talking, all this, the actual debating and so on and so forth, is Severus, is Bishop Severus ibn al-Muqaffa. Keep in mind that Patriarch Ephraim, his background was as a Syrian merchant. He was a layman, and there's nothing really about his background lend to the idea that he was scholarly per se. And in the majalis, not only are you debating religion, but there's also a very heavy dose of philosophy involved. And you had the representatives of the Copts, as I was mentioning, the Melkites. You had at least two representatives of the various Jewish factions. The Jewish community in Egypt was split. And you had representatives from the Sunni Muslim faction and from the Shia, the Fatimid faction. And they would discuss religion and debate religion. Some of these became quite sophisticated, some of these discussions, some of these debates. Unfortunately, and this kind of goes back to understanding Severus ibn al-Muqaffa, as the Bishop of al-Ashmunin, and unfortunately, our communal memory of him does him no favors. The one thing that everybody seems to remember is the account with Severus and Musa and the Qadi and Ibn Khalisa when he insults him, and with the events that lead to the moving of Muqattam. The other incident, the one with him, the Qadi and the dog, and the Qadi is probably Qadi Na'man, was the chief judge under the early Fatimids. If you remember that account, Severus and the Qadi are sitting there. It's on a Friday. A dog passes by. The Qadi asks him kind of this, not very gracious question of, Severus, who you think the dog is a Christian or a Muslim? And Severus comes back with, well, it's Friday. Christians don't eat meat, but they drink wine in communion. But Muslims eat meat. So let's put some wine and some meat in front of the dog and he can tell us what he is. It's an interesting story. It's a funny story. It's a memorable story. The problem with it is that Severus ibn al-Muqaffa, one of the major intellectual figures and authors we have in our history, kind of comes across as something of a smart aleck. He just, not quite a trickster, but a bit of a smart aleck. And that tends to be what is remembered. And he's a lot more than that. His authentic writings, again, he needs a lot more study than what has existed, but in some cases we're told 26, and others 38 compositions. With the two that are best attributed to him not being his, I already mentioned one, Dur al-Thamin. The other one is the history of the patriarchs, and this is one of those things that just we need to shake, because I don't want to get too technical and we don't have the time for it. But attributing it to Severus actually kind of problematizes some aspects. But the history of the patriarchs, Tarikh al-Batarka, it's clear that the attribution to him is erroneous, and that he had no part in any of it. And unfortunately, even the entry in the Coptic Encyclopedia, there was a little bit of tampering, if you will, with the original article that did not attribute any part of it to Severus, and there was a line added that kind of confuses the whole issue and the whole matter. The depth of his scriptural knowledge. Not only is he writing in Arabic and kind of defending church in Arabic, but it kind of shows us that in the Middle Ages, those that wrote within the church and defended Christianity and defined Christianity in Arabic within the church, these were not lightweights. These were very astute individuals who were not only steeped in the learning of the day, but steeped in the scriptures and in the life of the church. There's been a study made on one of the works of Severus. Now, it's a long work, but it's only one, and he has over 1,100 biblical citations in that one single book, in that one composition. Over and over again, when you read the material produced in our church in the Middle Ages, you'll see that there's a very deep reservoir that comes through in the reading of the scriptures. Every bit as deep as what you find with the patristic fathers. If anything, they now have more challenges to deal with. For the sake of time, I'm not going to discuss the miracle of the al-Muqaffa much. We're all familiar with it. Excuse me. The one thing I will mention is that the core of the miracle does relate to the scriptures. Okay, the core of it, it's not just simply the let's move a mountain and faith, so on and so forth, but it's about faith moving a mountain, but it's about the truthfulness of the Christian message and the Gospels. That is what it boils down to. When you read the details of the account carefully, the challenge is really, are your scriptures authentic or fraudulent? Everything else that follows is to be understood as a commentary on that, or an answer to that basic question. The other thing to keep in mind is that the retellings of the miracle become more and more and more fantastic, and you have kind of some really fun details that emerge that are great kind of for the story and when you're sharing the story. Personally, I don't think they're necessary. The oldest layer of the account that I'm aware of mentions an earthquake, that it was an earthquake. None of this, the mountain rising and the sun shining from underneath and the mountain moving as the Christians moved. All of these trappings are great, but the earliest account, it is an earthquake. But importantly, it's an earthquake that happened on command. So I don't think the miraculous element is is lessened there. I think it's still an important narrative and story within the community, but we have to kind of resist this impulse to make things more and more fantastic, that dilutes from their efficacy. As we leave the 10th century into the 11th, we come to the beginning of a difficult era for the church. Patriarch Philotheos and Zacharias, the period is difficult. Philotheos is not very reform-minded. If anything, he gives way to simony. Unfortunately, simony and the selling of offices is a constant problem all the way down until the mid 20th century. And these are just simply facts that we have to understand and to be cognizant of. This wasn't a Coptic problem per se. Simony was a problem with the Syrians, with the Roman Catholics, with the Greeks. I mean, it's not a Coptic problem per se, but it is a problem, and it's important for us to understand that it is something that is happening in the church. Patriarch Philotheos fell into that. Then you have the age of al-Hakim Bambillah. Now, this is one of those cases that really needs a lot of context. The early Fatimids were incredibly tolerant. If anything, you can even argue friendly to the Christians. The Fatimid administration in general, all the way down until we'll see in a minute the rise of the Ayyubids and Salah ad-Din, fairly tolerant, fairly accepting of Christians, and a lot of Christians got to very high positions under their watch. But you do have this anomaly of al-Hakim, which was extremely grim. And I don't want to downgrade that or dilute that, but it has to be understood within the context, because again, we have certain preconceived notions of our history that we need to be a bit more critical of, because one version of our history is that everything was horrible under Roman persecution. Then Constantine comes and we have a golden era of Athanasius to Kyrillos. Then we have Chalcedon. We turn off the lights in Chalcedon, and then it's one age of persecution after another, Byzantines, then Arabs, then Ottomans, then so and we turn the lights back on with well, it depends on your favorite Patriarch Cyril, either Cyril the Fourth or Cyril the Sixth. And yes, there's a lot of hardship in our history, but our history is a lot more than hardship. Here, al-Hakim comes to rule very early, and keep in mind that with the Fatimids and the Shi'is, it's all about the bloodline. It's all about the descent. So you have to come from the right family. You need the lineage. So even though he is 11, there's no way around it. He is the ruler. Initially, things are fine, but then he gets into this period of persecution. And notice that it's not at the very beginning of his rule, and the latter part of his rule, actually he calms down and a lot of things revert back to what they were. I have this period in which he starts, scholars still debate what exactly is happening. I think he's going loony. I think he is bringing about the full force of these dhul regulations, these debasement regulations that we had touched on last time. So kicking all Christians and Jews out of government service. The jizya is being increased. There's a whole bunch of restrictions being enforced. For some reason, he forbids women from being viewed, from at all being in a public sphere, and he bans them completely from baths. So even keep in mind that the baths at this time, the public baths, either they were unisex, so there was a women's bathhouse and a men's bathhouse, or the ones that that had both. I forget the exact arrangement, but there were set times for the two genders. So there's no chance of them crossing or what have you. But on one hand, he had it in for women. He had it in for chess. He outlawed chess. No chess in Egypt. And chess has an odd sort of history within Islamic civilizations in general. And to top it all off, he forbids mulukhiyah. He makes mulukhiyah illegal. To eat mulukhiyah becomes illegal. Closes all churches. All churches in Egypt are closed for several years. Some, we had mentioned conversion last time, and that accounts of forcible conversion at the edge of a sword or through violence, that the incidents in Egypt are very rare. this is where we get some of these rare instances. The one location that we know for certain that wasn't affected was the monasteries of Wadi Nakrun. For several years, the only place that you can openly, I'm sure that, they did it covertly, but the only place that you can kind of attend the liturgy openly and have communion openly was in Wadi Nakrun. And this comes about through a very bizarre, weird dynamic. The monasteries of Wadi Nakrun had this relationship, and it's a whole long topic we don't have time for, but they had this relationship with various Arab tribes in the region. And they were able to ally these Arab tribes so that the soldiers of al-Hakim were stopped from going into Wadi Nakrun by these Arab tribesmen. So it was Muslims stopping Muslims from attacking Christians. Please just remember to the mics, if you can mute the mics. The other thing he does, remember, their rule is extending throughout Egypt and into Syria and Jerusalem. But among the churches he destroys, and there's a lot of churches that he destroys, is the Holy Sepulchre, Knesset al-Qiyamah. And unfortunately, he makes this wordplay that is going to stick in Arabic sources, and it's going to be borrowed in Persian sources, medieval Persian sources, and in Turkish sources, where he'll have the wordplay on Qiyamah and Kumama, rubbish. So unfortunately, you'll see this in several authors, where when they're mentioning Knesset al-Kumama, the church of the rubbish heap, that is what they refer to the Holy Sepulchre as. It's not till later when the Crusaders coming to the region take over Jerusalem and kind of build a lot of the infrastructure that you see today in Jerusalem. But the original Holy Sepulchre, that was destroyed by al-Hakim. A lot of what he's doing doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The Druze, Muhammad al-Darzi, begins to interpret all of these actions as manifestations of divinity. And he starts preaching that al-Hakim is God, and he is sent away out of Egypt for his own protection. But then he starts preaching kind of the Druze religion or branch comes about from that. Druze usually don't count themselves as Muslims per se, but it depends on whom you ask. And Muslims usually do not consider Druze Muslims even, but again, it depends on whom you ask. A lot of these very oppressive measures start lifting towards the later part of his career. Even the forceful conversions. Now, in a couple of cases, we know that these individuals died. Okay. So they become martyrs. They were tortured in order to deny Christ, and they didn't. And these weren't, I mean, the sources here are wonderful to read, because these weren't monks, these weren't bishops, these were guys working kind of their 9-to-5 in the government. Others who had denied Christ, usually kind of in a strict line of Islamic interpretation, once you convert to Islam, you cannot revert. That is punishable by death. But this is one of those cases where he got the chief Qadi in Egypt, basically to nullify the conversion so they can go back to being Christians without any fear of reprisal or discrimination. Madness. One of the accounts we have is from a figure named Yahya al-Antaki, and Yahya knew him as a young man and spent a lot of time with him. Yahya is a Christian. And his assessment of his old friend was that, yeah, his old friend was kind of losing it. He was, but you know, there's several discussions in academic circles about exactly what is prompting him to engage in this erratic, odd, weird behavior. But it is important, with all of the difficulties, bloodshed, and oppression of this period, not to magnify this to be our entire existence under Islam. It just simply isn't. It's also here that you come across, there's an anecdotal, interesting reference here about tattooing crosses. Now, it's clear that it did not start here because it mentions it in passing as a long established sort of normal practice. And some kind of, in popular stories and accounts, kind of link it to the fact that one of the oppressive measures was that Christians had to go around with these heavy crosses on their necks, and it bruised them. And you know, you get in Arabic the expression of ibti adma zar'a. And all that is there, all that is well documented, but it doesn't appear that that is the beginning of the tattooing of crosses among the Copts. That practice appears to be older. Perhaps it gained a new meaning or relevance at this time, but it's older than al-Hakim. We get to the mid and late 11th century, we have two important patriarchs. One is Christodulus. Here, we start finding the first Arabic edicts in Arabic. Not enough caffeine today, not enough caffeine. The first official sort of documents from the church in Arabic, and the first canons. These are Christodulus and Cyril, and again, none of this is translated into Arabic, into Coptic. All of it is composed in Arabic, disseminated in Arabic, stays in Arabic. That early phase that Syria went through, where they needed to have text in both languages and bilingual editions, so on and so forth, that is just simply not what is happening in Egypt. In Egypt, the transition appears to have been later, and either it was more thorough or it was just so late that by the time it took place, you know, Arabic sufficed. Several things come in with Patriarch Christodulus, in addition to his canons. Personal confession. One of my pet peeves is the general funeral, so my apologies. But he is the one who starts the practice of the general funeral after Palm Sunday. And in my personal opinion, this is one of those things that is incredibly problematic. I mean, we can spiritualize it all you want. We can add a whole bunch of lofty layers to how to interpret it spiritually, this and that. All that is fine, but it's historically, theologically, this is a problematic ritual for me, and it's you, and nobody else has it. It's like we're trying to solve a problem that everybody has, and nobody thinks this is a good solution, and nobody thought of this solution before. And And in some ways, it's not even a problem because we do have clear evidence that there are prescribed prayers for those, literally for those who pass away during Holy Pascha. So I'll move on. But it starts with him. The sensitivity about touching the oblation kind of seems to come with him also. You may not be aware of this because, you know, if you're on the altar, you see this, but kind of, you know, typical lay person in the church, you don't quite see this. But the protocol around the altar and touching the oblation is somewhat restricted. There's kind of a sensitivity, even if you have, you know, 3-4 priests who will be dispensing communion. Touching the oblation is typically reserved for the one who is celebrating until there's the absolute necessity for the others to help out with communion or what have you. But a lot of that seems to come from his era. It also seems that this is where we start finding Arabic liturgical rubrics. Now, we don't have a lot of material that survives from this era, and this is a problem, but the rubrics here are important because we're going to have all Coptic liturgies, you know, in manuscript forms for centuries after this point. But when the rubric, when everything is in Coptic, but the rubric is in Arabic, the instructions are in Arabic. That lets you know that, you know, they're praying in Coptic, but they don't really understand. That becomes an issue. If the comprehension level was that high, the rubrics would be in Coptic. Succeeded by Cyril II. His elevation is a little bit problematic, and there's a hubbub between him and several of the bishops. Mahub ibn Mansur, that we'll come back to in a minute because he is a very important author at this point. He knew him personally, he interacted with him personally, and he makes kind of an analogy that Cyril has become something of a second Demetrius, with the traditional story of Patriarch Demetrius being ignorant and then becomes enlightened. But in this case, Mahub is very specific that, yeah, Cyril, even though he might have been picked for all the wrong reasons, and, you know, there's a whole debate about how he became patriarch, so on and so forth. And, you know, to make a long story very short, he appeared to be malleable, and the different factions that are doing the choosing thought that they can easily manipulate him as patriarch. But Cyril proves to be kind of not that easily manipulated. And he reads and he studies. And Mahub kind of has this firsthand account about how he is impressed by the progress that Cyril has made. But the problems between Cyril and his bishops go up to Badr al-Jamali. Badr al-Jamali was, and this is still under Fatimid rule, so the Fatimids are ruling, but under Badr al-Jamali and from the time of Badr al-Jamali on, the real power, the guy who's controlling armies and telling guys with swords where to go and what to do, is, you can call him a military governor of Egypt, the governor in charge of the armies, and that was Badr al-Jamali and his son after him. And Badr is the one, Badr is an Armenian convert to Islam. But he is very friendly towards the Christians in Egypt and very friendly towards his fellow Christian Armenians. There is an influx of Armenian Christians into Egypt at this time. And Badr al-Jamali kind of calls on Cyril to provide guidelines and canons for the church to kind of ease the problems with the bishops. And all of these kind of lead to the 34 canons of Patriarch Cyril. But this is one of those cases where it's important to see the dynamics. Oftentimes, our concept of kind of the Holy Senate and canons and so on and so forth is kind of what we have today, where the Holy Senate meets behind closed doors. Everybody is in black. They're all bishops. There's one priest that they allow in. All of that is modern. All of that is modern. When you look as far back as, even you can even see this in pre-Nicene synods, but from Nicaea to the ecumenical councils through the Middle Ages, the involvement of various church officials, civil officials, whether they are Byzantine and Christians early on or Muslims later, laymen of various capacities, in presence, speaking, all of that was fairly normal. I mean, the proceedings were led by kind of the ecclesiastical dignitaries, but oftentimes kind of what's moving things kind of one step to the next, and not only keeping records and the like, but in some cases later on with al-Safi ibn al-Assal, that unfortunately we will just touch on very briefly. He's a layman, but he is the canonist in the room. So he is the one who is speaking. He is the one who is presenting the documents for everyone else to discuss. Now, in a minute, we'll discuss Mawhub ibn Mansur. Mawhub is the one who actually writes or edits the history of the patriarchs. He's stressing everything up to Christodulus and Cyril. But he writes the biographies of patriarchs Christodulus and Kyrillos Itheni in Arabic, and these were his contemporaries that he interacted with on a fairly regular basis. So these two biographies are fairly rich because of that. This, of course, lends our way to the history of the patriarchs. Tarikh al-Batarka. For the medieval history of our church, this is the most important text. It's a complicated text. I will not try to give you the ins and outs of it right now, because how to read it at different junctures, at different passages, that we can have an entire semester-long course on. What I do want you to know is that for our history up to the 14th century, there is a tremendous amount of material that we only know from the history of the patriarchs. And as you can see from the bulletin down here, is going to influence every major text that comes after it. The Siniksar, the history of the churches and monasteries of Egypt, Kitab al-Tarikh of Ibn Rahib, everything that comes after it is going to be influenced by the history of the patriarchs. Attributed traditionally to Severus al-Muqaffa, but as we mentioned earlier, it's definitely not his. Severus, if you remember, died sometime after 1110, probably is a better estimate. The history of the patriarchs, as we know it, is compiled by Mawhub ibn Mansur in Alexandria in the end of the 11th century, right about 1090. So 90 years after Severus had died, this text is put in circulation. It survives in several recensions, the primitive or the older recension that is thought to date to the 11th century. And this recension is hopefully going to be, only a section of it has been published a long time ago in a very difficult to find German publication. There are new editions of it being prepared. They should be published soon. The one that is easily accessible is the Vulgate recension, the 13th century recensions in the plural. This is the one that you might have a copy of the Arabic at home or online. The full translation is online. All of that material that can be accessed readily and easily, all of that is really the later version of the text. In some cases, it doesn't really matter, because when you compare them, the Vulgate being later is just more refined Arabic, and substituting in some cases kind of really arcane terms for less arcane terms. Keep in mind that this is written in the 11th and 13th century, not the 20th century. But in other cases, it does make a difference. It does make a difference what happened to the text from the primitive to the Vulgate. But all that is the work of Mahub. He got all of the earlier sections, and this is kind of a tradition that goes back in our history for some time, where ever so often somebody would write the biographies of patriarchs from his day back to whoever wrote before him. And in some cases, that's just 2 or 3 patriarchs. In some cases, that's a dozen patriarchs. And as I was just mentioning earlier, he translates everything and edits everything up to his time, and then he personally authors the biographies of Christodulus and Cyril II, those composed in Arabic and remain in Arabic, even though we do have good evidence that Mahub was fully bilingual. Mahub himself was fully conversant in Arabic and Coptic. He would speak Coptic as a mother tongue. One of the things that happens in the Middle Ages that we completely take for granted today is the relocation of the Patriarchate from Alexandria to Cairo. Because today we don't even think about it. It's like, well, who's the Patriarch of the Coptic Church? Well, the Patriarch is the Bishop of Alexandria. Well, where is he? Where can we find him? Where can we meet him? Oh, in Cairo. Well, at some point that happened. And what happens here is really a process. It's not an event. And a lot of books that you'll consult will just simply say, well, it's with Cyril II that we relocated to Cairo. It's a lot more complicated than that. It's really a process that went on. From the time of the conquest until the mid-11th century, patriarchs, again, their bishopric is Alexandria, but they tended to be absentee a lot of times. They were kind of hovering around Cairo in one way or another. And keep in mind that Cairo officially comes into being with the Fatimids. Prior to that, it was Fustat, right outside what we call Old Cairo. If you ever visit the Coptic Museum is in Old Cairo proper. But they tend to be kind of in and around because Cairo had its own bishop, and you can't have 2 bishops in one place. So they needed to be closer to the political hub, because the political hub under Islam was not Alexandria, it was Fustat and then Cairo, and kind of in the head of the delta. But they kind of had this phase that I call the itinerant phase. Then you have kind of the process. And the process itself is interesting, because some of the things that we talk about casually, within our history, this was taken very, very seriously. Now it's Cyril II who ordained Senhut, a figure named Senhut, as the bishop of Mis Cairo kind of referring to the older part, Fustat, and it becomes that expression even in Arabic sources, and the medieval Arabic sources is common. Tries to relocate. And there is a lot of political background here, because the Fatimids wanted kind of the heads of the different major sects close at hand, if you will, at their capital. But it was Patriarch Mikhail IV. Mikhail is a form of Mikhail. Mikhail, they're all related. But he attempted to have something of a forceful takeover. And he kicked out the bishop Sanhut and tried to take over Cairo, Misr. The laity would not have it. And kind of that imagery we often discuss about the bishop being married to their diocese, that comes in repeatedly. And here they tell him in no uncertain terms, you can't do it because there's no sharing. You can't share a wife. They put it quite bluntly. This is the bishopric of Bishop Sanhut. You can't be co-bishop or replace him as a bishop while he's alive. So that didn't work. Later, Macarius II tries to take over Misr. Now, if you look at the dates, Sanhut had passed away. Patriarch Macarius tried to kind of, while there's a vacancy, just to kind of take over Cairo. And again, the Cairenes objected. And here we have it from an author of this era that we know, Ibn Khaldun, and he kind of drafts the official response of the people, telling him, you can't have two wives. The patriarch is the Bishop of Alexandria. That is his bishopric. How are you going to have two bishoprics if the bishop is married to one bishopric? No man can have two wives, no bishop can have two dioceses. And hence, he was more or less forced to get the biological son of Sanhut, and this is interesting, Ioannis, to become the bishop of Misr. Keep in mind that for individuals to, especially widowers who were, after having children and a career, to be ordained priests, to be ordained bishops, was not really uncommon in our history. I mean, today we kind of have this idea of all monks, all lifelong celibates, and so on and so forth, even though the apostles themselves were quite mixed. Throughout the Middle Ages, widowers were just fine. Whether they are priests or monks, or in some cases laity, who were elevated to various ranks. Eventually, it's Gabriel II, Gabriel ibn Tariq, who is finally successful in taking over and kind of sequestering Misr, Cairo, in addition to Alexandria. Still, you'd have anomalies. The major one, Bulis al-Bushi. Bulis al-Bushi is one of the major authors we have in the heyday of the 13th century. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot by him in English, but if you can read Arabic, I would definitely encourage you to read his available writings in Arabic. His sermons are on par with anyone you've ever read. But Bulis al-Bushi is appointed Patriarch of Cairo during a tense period in the 13th century, and I won't get to it to kind of keep within our time and chronological limitations. But during that period, you have Cyril III, and Cyril III is patriarch who, well, again, a personal bias, but Cyril III was an absolute disaster. Intelligent, educated, but really, really into simony. And Bulis al-Bushi was something of the counterweight, someone who not at all interested in in money or power. And it was almost like, well, because you're not interested in these things, you'll be the perfect candidate to kind of be the counterweight for Cyril in Cairo. But that is an exception. Again, that line of bishops of Babylon, of Misr Cairo, this is a long line that goes back into the Byzantine era, more or less comes to an end with Gabriel II. As we get into the transition, the 12th century, from the Fatimids to the Ayyubids, the big figure is Saladin, not an actual depiction here, but this is inspired by the actor that played him in, I think, the movie Kingdom of Heaven. The official takeover is 11th of September, 1171, so right on Coptic New Year. In reality, it's really a period of transition, but Salah ad-Din is in command, fully in command from that date on. Salah ad-Din, when he comes in, and the Ayyubids in general, have something of a legitimacy problem. They bring Egypt back to Sunni Islam, but to avoid a really long, complicated, convoluted political history, Salah ad-Din needed to legitimize his position. And this came by a couple of things. One of them is positioning himself as the anti-crusader, that he will be the one taking on the Crusaders, and that works tremendously for him. And along with that comes the development of a genre in Islamic literature known as the genre of the 40 hadith. The 40 hadith is a genre that starts around jihad and the importance of jihad, and it's kind of playing up the importance of fighting against the infidel, which all of it kind of bolsters Salah ad-Din's persona and footing in Egypt. The early phase, up until the Battle of Hattin, is very, very problematic for the church. Why? Well, one of the surefire ways, and we don't have the time to get into it, but you see it over and over again whenever you have a Muslim ruler coming into Egypt or other places, and they want to kind of legitimize themselves and kind of bolster their credentials, they crack down on the fringe of the Muslim community, anyone who's not practicing true, real Islam, however that is defined, and on the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews, so that they, quote, may know their place. So in the early phase, the Dhul regulations are brought in. It's a difficult period. After the Battle of Hattin, after he's kind of secured his legacy and is not threatened anymore, more or less, he then relaxes the Dhul regulations, and then relations between him and the Christian community improve a lot. But the early phase is quite stressful for the church and community. He takes over the central mosque, al-Azhar, and converts it into a Sunni institution. Al-Azhar was built as a Shi'i institution by the Fatimids, but with his conversion, it will remain as such down until today. Al-Azhar is Sunni today because of Salah ad-Din. He'll become the patron of the Shafi'i school in Egypt, and that has its own sort of history. But the point I want you to note is that he begins courting Sufi orders. Sufis are much more enamored with, typically, with an esoteric allegorical reading of the Quran and of Islam. But they come in many, many different types and varieties. They are, quote unquote, the mystical Muslims. And some of them go as far as saying that, to read the Quran literally is to completely misunderstand it. That the true Quran is really their own very allegorical interpretation of it, that in some cases is hard to reconcile with the letter or kind of the black letter reading of the Quran. And the mistake that even many authors make until today is this idea that, well, Sufis in Egypt is a good thing because they're associating Sufism with this sort of, there are different paths up the mountain, and God is the God of all of humanity, and the most important thing is to experience God and not to follow legalistic rules, so on and so forth. And you can find all of those strains in Sufism. The problem is that in Egypt, the type of Sufism that dominated in Egypt wasn't the kumbaya, all roads lead up the mountain type of Sufism. It's important to be pious and to have an allegorical interpretation of the Quran, and to be very rigorous when it comes to the Muslims and the Jews, so we can help them along onto conversion and onto the path of Islam. The type of Sufi brotherhoods in Egypt was much more militant and much sharper than what you find Sufism as kind of casually defined, or as it was practiced in other locations. This is important. This is important because there's several things that are going to happen in the course of the succeeding centuries that will be detrimental for the church, and the cause of it, or the catalyst for it, are Sufi orders. There'll be a couple of major riots, anti-Christian riots under the Mamluk dynasty. Some of the most devastating in the mid-14th, 14th century, the mid-1300s. Churches from Alexandria to Aswan are going to be the object of rioting, of destruction, of burning, all on one day. In Islamic sources, it will be legitimized as, how else could this take place? Remember, this is pre-modern technology and communication and movement. How else can this take place other than it's a sign of God? It's miraculous. It is God showing the Christians that Islam is the true religion, so on and so forth. When you look at the details, though, it's clear that the Sufi brotherhoods are behind this. And the Sufi brotherhoods, whereas in Islam, you can argue that every mosque and every congregation is independent of the others, the Sufi brotherhoods are organized. The Sufi brotherhoods are a network throughout Egypt. So if you take that into account, then yeah, rioting, looting, destroying Christian properties on one day, it took a bit of pre-planning, but it's not at all miraculous. This is Sufi, inspired by the Sufis and done by the Sufis at the hands of the Sufis. Let me just check time. I don't want to. I'll be quick. I'm already over. Translation and authorship. This is a process that takes place, and it's first one to kind of provide us with a really good scheme for it is Samuel Rubinson, and kind of everything refers back to his work on this. It's a bit dated now, but it's still kind of the fundamental building block. It's largely about translation from Sahidic, Coptic, and Greek. Keep in mind, Greek is still important. We talked about that last time. To Arabic and Bohairic Coptic. Arabic and Bohairic Coptic are really on par as far as antiquity, and it's not uncommon to find something in Arabic that's older than Bohairic, or in Arabic that gets translated into the Bohairic. This idea that we have that, well, if it's in Coptic, somehow it's older and more pure than Arabic, they're just simply not the case. The first phase, early phase, mid-9th century to 11th century, a lot of the translations are described as ad hoc, kind of on the fly and necessary. Liturgical texts, things of that nature, things that are apologetic and dogmatic. Keep in mind that by this point, intellectual Islamic attacks against Christianity have been going on for, if we look at Severus as the first one to respond, for 2 centuries. The second phase, it becomes sanctioned. There's a lot of translations of liturgical texts, liturgical books, officially being translated and used by the church. And this is the phase where we have a lot of historical texts coming in, that like the history of the patriarchs I was just mentioning. That is a very important text, and comes into Arabic, and all the continuations are in Arabic. We have to pause a little with Gabriel ibn Turiq. He comes at a very important juncture, and kind of the sanctioning aspect of it, of this translation movement, is set to come to Gabriel. I don't want to spend time on it that we don't have, but at the same time, there's a lot of sort of things out there in the community and in some books and so on and so forth that kind of goes over this whole thing about, well, if only Gabriel ibn Turiq did not initiate his reforms. He dictates that Arabic be used in the church. He limits the liturgies. Now, this is kind of a separate thing, but he's the one that limits our liturgies to the 3 that we have till today. Prior to that, we had several more, And there's this blaming of Gabriel ibn Turiq as to the church becoming quote unquote Arabic. And when you look at what he asked for, I mean, he sanctioned the translations, and he mandated that readings, after they're read in Coptic, they need to be read in Arabic. And there's some people that just completely lose it at this. When you look at the evidence, there's several things that need to be kept in mind. One is, excuse my sarcasm, but when have you found the institutional church proactive on anything? This idea that Gabriel ibn Turiq kind of took it upon himself to make Arabic the language of the church, so on and so forth. By its very nature, the institutionalized aspect of the church is highly, highly reactive. It is never proactive. You can trace this all the way back to Nicaea. They're not sitting there in Nicaea and saying, well, now all else being equal, let's sit down in a calm, cool, and collective manner and hammer out what we believe about the divinity of God. No, you have the challenge from Arianism. These ideas are in circulation, and now the church has to react. This is how things work historically. To presume that Gabriel ibn Turiq kind of took it upon himself to Arabize the church, it fundamentally misses the reading of history. Second, as we've been mentioning, he comes about in the mid-12th century, from the time of Severus ibn al-Muqaffa, 2 centuries earlier. All of the theological literature, all of the major texts are produced in Arabic from the time of Christodulus on, from a century earlier. All of the official literature and edicts of the church are issued in Arabic. Gabriel ibn Turiq here is doing nothing other than recognizing the status quo. He's telling them, read the Arabic after the Coptic, because clearly they can't understand the Coptic. And this comes after that merging that we spoke of last time, where kind of you had this melding of ideology and language, where Greek becomes heretical, Coptic is Christian, Arabic is Islamic, and with something like Pseudo Samuel that rails against the use of Arabic in the church. But Gabriel ibn Turiq is looking and saying, well, what good is it to read the Epistle of St. Paul in Coptic when no one understands it? There's certain just very basic practical aspects in play here. Ubrad and Tariq, it is not to be blamed for why the church uses Arabic today. We were using Arabic long before Ubrad was even born. The third phase, and this kind of goes into the early 1300s, hence the 14th century. You have revision and refinement. A lot of the older texts that were kind of translated quickly and haphazardly, they're some cases retranslated, in some cases just the Arabic becomes grammatically a lot more refined, and you can tell somebody spent more time with the translation here, that it's a lot more polished than the older materials. And the material is all over the spectrum. We have historical texts, liturgical, theological, hagiographic, apocryphal, and of course, throughout the whole period, biblical is in the mix. That doesn't go away, but in some ways, the biblical is a little bit easier because it's not exclusively Coptic. We don't really disagree with the Melkites about the text of the New Testament. So when there is a translation made by a Melkite, the Copts, they used it, and vice versa, because we disagree as to the interpretation, but not the text. Once you get past 1350, then there's a decline, and there's a little bit of a renaissance at the end of the century and at the very beginning of the 1400s. But then it's a very steep decline in the production of all literature down until, you can argue all the way down until the 19th century. But after we're leaving the 12th century and just a peek into the 13th, a lot of the major compositions, the Difnar, the Siniksar, the history of the churches and monasteries, all of that is going to be written during that period. The mid-13th century, you have the Muqaddimat and Salalim. These are dictionaries and grammars of Coptic that use Arabic as the language of instruction to teach Coptic. Okay, so it's very clear that by the mid-1200s, Coptic literacy is in decline. The major liturgical sort of references that we have, Ibn Sabbah and Ibn Kabar, they are a product of the early 14th century. And really the only text that we have that was approved by Synod after review as far as liturgical cycles is a Tartib al-Taqsi in the early 1400s. Everything else, it just kind of, this monastery in the modern era, this monastery published this or that, and that becomes normative, but you don't really have anything resembling how a Tartib al-Taqsi was collated, discussed by a Synod, and not only issued by the Patriarch, but issued with the Patriarch with the full approval of a Synod that actually sat there, read it, and discussed it, not rubber stamping it. There's an actual deliberation here. I will stop here. I'm already kind of over my time. I'll leave the normal canons and the discussion of the normal canons to another time, another day. Thank you all.